Greetings, heroes. How are you doing? I don't know if you can see me yet, but I'm certainly talking right now. So if you can hear my voice, hit me up in the chat. Say, hello, Rabbi John Carrier, or hello, you dude, and let me know where you're coming from so that I know that this is going out to people. Today we're going to be talking about Jewish prayer. And I want to give kind of an introductory level. Now, I know a lot of people know a lot about Jewish prayer. I've been studying it for quite some time myself and actively doing it for about 20 years now. But I wanted to help people who are just kind of working their way into Jewish holy spaces or Jewish religious observance to give you kind of a foundation in Jewish prayer and the contemporary mode of how Jews pray, let's say on average, where it comes from. So you have a little bit of understanding there so that when you go into a synagogue space, you know a little bit more about what's going on. I'm just going to say, based on what is, I think, my most popular YouTube video, which is entitled, I Don't Get It, Understanding the Synagogue Service, there's a lot of people who walk into synagogues and just don't know what's going on. And this is especially tragic for people who have been Jewish their whole life, because the synagogue is supposed to be the one place where every Jew feels welcome, safe, a sense of belonging. But sometimes going into those spaces, if you're not familiar with the prayer service or what Jewish prayer means, can feel foreign. And I think that's a great loss. I think that's a great tragedy. And so I just want to do my one little part here to help people understand where Jewish prayer came from, what kind of the architecture of Jewish prayer is. You know, how many services are there on a daily basis? How are weekday prayers different from Shabbat prayers, different from holiday prayers? What do those services contain, right? Because the services are actually very predictable in the sense that a lot of elements kind of are repeated every single day or overlap or are repeated between weekdays and Shabbat and holidays. And so once you get a handle on kind of the structure of a Jewish prayer service, it breaks down a little bit of that barrier. Now, there may still be a language barrier. There may still be a belief barrier. Some people look at the translations of prayers and say, oh, that's what we're saying? I don't believe that. That's not how I relate to God, or I don't really relate to God at all. So what am I doing here? Those kinds of barriers are addressed in other ways. I mean, you can gain familiarity with the language by, frankly, repetition, right? And for people for whom there's sort of a belief barrier, I'll say it's still instructive, helpful. And I'm speaking, I'm not like preaching at you. This is my own experience. Like, I haven't always believed the same things that I believe today. And it's only through taking a look at these prayers and saying, okay, maybe that guy from the Stone Ages doesn't necessarily speak for me. However, what he is expressing in his own language, describing this encounter with the divine, I can kind of relate to that. Like, I can kind of connect with the sentiment. I can connect with the feeling. I can respect that divine encounter. And maybe as I'm saying these traditional words, I'm reflecting in my own language, my own experience. So I don't want to get too deep into it there. I just want to acknowledge the people who have joined us. We've got my friends Ruth, my friend Kathy is here. We got Teresa's in from Cyprus. We've got Vanessa, new face Erica. Maybe not a new face, but let's see. So Erica's here. Let's see. Milo's here. Thank goodness. So many good friends. Jessica's here from Boca Raton. We got Cyprus. We got California. We got Arizona. We have, apparently somebody says, see and hear you. Kathy knows that I like to know whether the audio and video are coming through okay, because I'm still kind of new at this YouTube live thing. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to ask, well, I'm not going to tell you. You do you. But I'm going to ask you a favor. If you have a question about Jewish prayer, please type that into the chat, right? And we're going to accumulate these questions over time. Sometimes there's a bit of a lag between when I'm talking and when the chats come out. So I'm just going to ask this: what questions do you have about Jewish prayer? And then while we're gathering some questions, I'll give a little bit of a talk on the history of Jewish prayer. And then I'll go back to what questions you have. And we'll just have kind of as the rabbis say, a shachla v'tarya, like a back and forth. And we'll learn a lot together that way. I have complete faith. I am in the faith business. So let's do this. Ask me what questions you have about Jewish prayer. Hey, Suzanne from Sunnyvale, California. I remember you. So glad to see you. We've got somebody from Brazil. We are worldwide, y'all. So ask me your questions about Jewish prayer. Keep giving me props. Keep letting me know where you're from, and I will dive in from time to time in the chat. What I want to talk about now is sort of the history of where Jewish prayer came from, or rather the history of Jews talking to God, right? Because prayer has a lot of different values or aspects to it. Sometimes people pray and they're not really talking to God. It's sort of more of a meditative moment or a self-reflective moment. That's okay too. The sort of original basis for prayer had to do with reaching out for a mystical experience. And I'm using mystical as a technical term here. I learned this definition from one of my heroes, Rabbi Adam Greenwald, who says, mysticism in the sort of technical theological vocabulary is, mysticism is seeking the experience of God, right? Versus theology, which is sort of seeking an understanding about God, right? And the difference being, okay, I can think, I can use logic, I could use, whatever rational faculties I have to try to understand the nature of God, and that is sort of theology. Whereas mysticism is, I'm not talking about God, I'm trying to talk to God, or I'm trying to experience the presence of God in my life. And this is accomplished in different ways. This is accomplished by looking for deeper meaning in study. A primary way of doing this is through meditation. If you can meditate in a certain way that, calms you down, gets you into a certain frame of mind that helps you experience things that you don't experience when you are, on your busy day-to-day activities, running around from different places, going to the post office, going to the bank, trying to get your job done, trying to get your kids fed. We're not, when we are taking care of those important things in our life, we're not necessarily open to an experience of, let's say, an encounter with the unseen. And so mysticism tries to use things like meditation, things like singing, things like prayer to have an experience of an encounter with God. And I'll say that doesn't always work, right? Meditation doesn't always work in that you can sit down to meditate and you count your breath, you do your mantra, you say your prayer, however it works for you, and you say, I've been doing this for 20 minutes and God hasn't stopped by once, right? So is it a failure? Is it a waste of time? No, because if you are putting yourself in that framework over and over again, every once in a while, if things go well, you can have this experience of being in the presence of something greater than yourself. And that's the simplest way I'm going to put it. For some people, that's God. For some people, that's some other higher power or some other higher sense of self. But that is the thrust of prayer in general. And where this, what makes this Jewish, or where this comes into play into Judaism, begins back in sort of, I'll say, personal revelation, right? In the book of Genesis, we have people talking to God, or God talking to people, and people saying, "Here I am," or "Oh no, I'm gonna hide." That happened too. So God speaks to Adam and Eve. God speaks to Noah. God speaks to Avram, and then later gives him a new name, Avraham. God speaks to Moses, to Moshe, several times, in fact. And so people have these encounters with God. They're not necessarily praying or seeking that experience, but it just happens upon them, right? And God reveals God's self to them in these private moments. Another way that people interact with God for a long time now in a bunch of different cultures, not just Judaism, but in cultures all over the world, especially in ancient times, but even to this day, is sacrifice. And sacrifice can mean a lot of different things. In general, sacrifice is taking something good that you have and giving it, or donating it, or dedicating it, or a proportion of it, to God, or to people who then represent God or minister that to God. The first time we see this is, again, back in the very beginning of the book of Genesis with Cain and Abel. Right now, that's not the story I like to teach a whole lot because bad stuff happens there. But there's a story about the first two brothers who ever existed, and one of them, Cain, raised crops. He was kind of a farmer, and Abel raised sheep and cows. He was kind of a rancher, if you will. And each of them took part of what they had gathered in, what they had harvested, whether it was grain or whether it was meat, and they set aside some for God, or they offered it up as an offering. And the story goes that God first accepted Abel's offering, and Cain took this badly, right? He said, oh, maybe God likes him better than he likes me, so I think I'm going to invent murder. And then he kills his brother. So that's another discussion for another time, although I just want to be clear, murder's bad, y'all. But it all happened in the context of a sacrifice. It happened where these two individuals were reaching out for the divine to show gratitude, appreciation, to show supplication for future bounty. And this is a way that human beings have tried to connect with the divine for thousands of years. In fact, we see, and this is in the story of Noah. Noah, when the boat lands, he thanks God by sacrificing animals. And you could say, well, that's terribly dangerous. He only had 2 of each animal. We kind of preloaded the ark. If you look closely at the story, there was 2 of each kind of animal, except for the sacrificing animals, and then there were 7 pair of each of those. So that was good planning, I think, on their part. But Noah does a sacrifice, and in Avram's time, people were doing sacrifices. People were commonly sacrificing to idols or images of other gods. And then we have this private revelation again where God says, I want to have a special relationship with you and with your family. And thank God, because now there are Jews today. And so we go back and forth between these sort of conversations and these sacrifices. Eventually this family goes into Egypt. Slavery happens, bad stuff happens, 10 plagues, bada bing, the Exodus. It's like, did he just yada yada the Exodus? But anyway, we leave Egypt. And God has this people, and God, basically wants to give us a new religion, as it were. We now have renewed this covenant. We're renewing how we connect to God, and God tells us exactly how to do this. In the last couple of chapters of the Torah, we've been reading about how to build a portable sanctuary to worship God, how to create a priestly group or caste, and what they would do in terms of sacrificing animals and other vegetables and things like that. But, sorry, just I had a text buzz in my pocket that always distracts me. So we have this mode of connecting to God, and people thought, well, this God doesn't need our sacrifices. This God doesn't eat. We don't think about this God in the same way. However, God knew, and this is an interpretation of Maimonides and others, God knew that if God structured the religion in such a way that it was wholly different from how people had related to God before, if God said, hey, I don't need sacrifices, that stuff's Egyptian and bogus and don't do it anymore. If that was the approach that God took, we wouldn't have known what to do, right? Sacrificing stuff is how you talk to God. And instead, God said, okay, you keep doing how you know how to do religion. However, I'm going to make a few different changes here and there. Not everybody's going to sacrifice. Only the priests are going to sacrifice. And you can't do it anywhere you feel like. You have to do it in this one place, in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and later on in the temple. And so God let us keep doing sacrifices so that we would stay in conversation the only way we knew how. But then made these subtle changes that eventually would allow us to wean off of doing sacrifices when the time came, and that was precipitated by the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem. And we were, our temple was destroyed, the city was sacked, we were exiled to Babylonia, and some people said, oh no, we can't be Jewish anymore because we can't do our sacrifices the way that God wants us to do. But some folks were like, well, how about this? Yes, it's terrible that we can't do the sacrifices. What if instead we studied the sacrifices and we prayed, we meditated at the same time of day that we used to do the sacrifices? And so just for now, while we're in exile, and we don't know how long that's going to be, but while we're in exile, let's substitute prayer and study for those sacrifices. But they were still very much connected. In the temple times, there were three main sacrifices a day. There was a morning sacrifice, the shachrit sacrifice. There was the afternoon or mincha sacrifice, because there was grains. Mincha means grain. It was mixed in with the other things, uniquely in the afternoon. And there was a nighttime sacrifice or an evening sacrifice that went on that was sort of like left to burn overnight. So we had morning, afternoon, and evening sacrifices. P.S. on Shabbat and on holidays, there would be additional sacrifices in honor of those special days, or additional, or musaf in Hebrew. And so the rabbis decided, what if we have prayer services that we'll call them the same thing. We have our shachrit prayer, our mincha prayer, and our mariv or arvit evening prayer. And we'll talk about the temple. We'll pray for us, to get it back again. And instead of, let's say, that event of sacrificing an animal, we instead have a moment of silent, private meditation. This would become the Amidah. What we know today as the Amidah began as silent, personal, private meditation. Over time, for the sake of people who didn't have the vocabulary or frequent experience of prayer, we got a suggested script. The rabbis created these blessings for us so that we would have blessings to say if we didn't know what else to say. Whenever I lead services today, when it's time for the Amidah, I say, okay, it's time for the Amidah. If you want to use the traditional words on the page, these are the words given to us over centuries and millennia by our tradition as being good words to focus our attention, focus our hearts on God. But if you have something else to say to God, or if you have something else to meditate on, that's totally okay too, and you can do that in this moment, and we'll all, get back together in a minute with a song, I guess. So that's where the Amidah started. The morning, afternoon, and evening sacrifices became the morning, afternoon, and evening Amidah. Added to that, we're instructed to say the Shema twice a day. This comes from the book of Deuteronomy. It says the Shema Yisrael, etc. And then immediately following that is a paragraph that contains the line, "You shall speak these words when you lie down and when you rise up." And so we say, okay, we will. And we have in the morning service, right before the Amidah, we have the Shema and blessings around that. In the evening service, the same. Right before the Amidah, we have the Shema and some blessings around that. In the afternoon, nobody's, on average, nobody's lying down and getting up, so we don't have a Shema. In the afternoon, we basically just have the Amidah. And so this is the core of how Jewish prayer is said today. Every single day, we have, and for some communities, this is considered an obligation. Some communities, it's considered an opportunity. But whatever gets you there, whatever draws you there, we have morning, afternoon, and evening prayers in traditional Jewish practice every single day. On Shabbat, we add a little something to the Friday evening service. We add Kabbalat Shabbat before the regular evening service as a way to kind of focus our attention and welcome Shabbat before we start our evening prayers. And then on Shabbat morning, we have, in addition to the regular morning service, we have Musaf. We have an additional Amidah, right? Because that's on Saturday morning, there used to be an additional sacrifice, and we have substituted the Amidah for sacrifices. So we're going to have a Musaf Amidah, an additional prayer service, if you will. And then on holidays as well, there are additional Musaf services, and we also add in something called Hallel on holidays, which is 5-10 minutes, depending on how musical you want to get with it, a passage or an anthology of psalms of praise that were appropriate to holidays. So that's a lot of information about the history of where Jewish prayer came from, why it's set up the way it's set up. And I'm going to pause here and go to some questions. Let's see. We got hi from Brazil. We got Sunnyvale, California. What are the Jewish prayers for the morning and before going to sleep at night? Great question. And these I didn't necessarily include in the prayer services because traditionally these are things that are said at home. There's a series of blessings that we say in the morning. The first one you get to say is called the Modeh Ani. Modeh Ani lefanecha melechai v'kayam she'ezar tabi nishpati bechem l'rabba mutecha. So I'm just remember because I don't know how to say it slowly because I say it kind of out of habit these days. But you can find that Modeh Ani in a prayer book, or you can find it on YouTube on somebody else's channel. I always if you could learn something from somebody else, please go do that. And I don't stop anybody from learning from anybody else. But that's a prayer that's basically acknowledging the generosity of God for guarding us in our sleep and restoring us to consciousness. So, like, first thing we say is, "Thank God I'm awake." Right? Thank God thank God who restored my awareness to me. It means restored my soul to me, because there was an idea that when we went to sleep, our souls departed, and if the souls didn't come back, we didn't wake up. And so the first thing we say is, thank you, God, for restoring my soul and allowing me to wake up. And you could read that metaphorically as well, like restoring consciousness, restoring strength and vigor, and allowing me to face another day. So that's a blessing that we say in the morning. There's a list of several other blessings that we say in the morning. We bless God for the strength. We bless God for making us a free people. We bless God for giving us the mitzvot and setting us apart. We bless God for all sorts of things, and those are given to us in the prayer book to say upon rising. In between there's some people do a hand washing, like do a netilat yadayim, and the fun fact, Modeh Ani, that first prayer we say in the morning, doesn't contain explicitly the name of God, right? We acknowledge the King, but we don't say God, because what we want to do before we start using God's name is wash our hands. Just like you wash your hands before saying the Motzi for Challah, or wash your hands for other holy occasions. It's not a hygienic cleansing as much as it is a spiritual cleansing. So we say Modeh Ani, which doesn't have God's name in it. Then we wash our hands. Then we bless God for the commandment to wash hands. And then we say other blessings. And these are all things you could do at home before you go to the synagogue. Some synagogues are generous and assume that, hey, in case you forgot to say those morning blessings, we'll include those in the prayer service. And some places do, some places don't. But that covers morning prayers that you can say at home. And then there are prayers we say before going to sleep at night. So I said we have a morning Shema and a morning Shema and an evening Shema. You can also say Shema right before going to bed, and many people have this practice of saying not just those six words of Shema Yisrael, etc., but add additional blessings to that. In many prayer books, you can find the bedtime Shema, where it'll have a page or two of traditional prayers, and you do what is comfortable for you. But there's this value that you wake up in the morning, the first thing you do is you talk to God. You go to bed at night, the last thing you do is talk to God. And the custom is that after you say the bedtime Shema, no more talking. Like, you don't say anything after this. So, not for nothing, this is the first prayer that Jewish children learn. Like, basically when they're old enough to talk and to repeat a sentence, even if they don't speak Hebrew in any other aspect of their life, we teach them the Shema, right? Because it's like, other cultures have this where kids say their prayers before they go to bed. Our version of that is kids say, and not just kids, adults do this too, but kids start to learn how to say the Shema before they go to bed. That sort of brings them, closes the day, bringing them back into awareness of the people that they're a part of and the God that we're connected to. And I'll just say another side benefit of this for parents is it's a great way to get kids, I'll just speak very frankly here, it's a great way to get kids to shut up at bedtime. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is, you tuck them in, they say goodnight, they want water, they want a story, they need to go to the bathroom 3 times. And if the kids keep talking, you just say, you said the Shema, can't talk anymore, that's the rule. And so I've used that on more than one occasion, I'll confess. So, do Jews pray before or after meals? Excellent question, Vanessa. The answer is yes, in the sense that when we have meals or anytime we have food, we're called on to say a blessing, acknowledging God as the source of all our blessings, including that food. And then after meals, we have what's called Birkat Hamazon, or the blessings of sustenance, also called in some translations grace after meals. And so, immediately that's kind of a difference between, let's say, Jewish practice versus Christian practice, where grace is said before a meal, and that's sort of it's a difference between like a blessing and grace. Grace is sort of like is almost like a whole service unto itself with several blessings. But instead of saying grace before a meal, we say grace after a meal. This comes directly from a quote from Deuteronomy, I think, where it says, when you enter the land, the promised land, you're going to raise, you're going to raise crops, and you're going to be able to feed your animals, and then you are going to eat and be satisfied and bless. And so we do it in that order. We say a blessing before we eat, but for the big blessing, we eat, we're satisfied, and then we bless, right? And so that's what the Birkat Hamazon is all about. Hey, we had a great meal. And it's traditionally said, you could say it by yourself, but it's the sort of rule is that if you have 3 or more people who have shared bread in that meal, that's sort of the minimum requirement for Birkat Hamazon. And so sometimes you might just have 2 people and they say, we don't have to say Birkat Hamazon. And sometimes they say it anyway. Sometimes people will say, I don't have to say Birkat Hamazon because it takes a little while. Some people say, I don't have to say Birkat Hamazon because I didn't eat bread. Right, or I'm gluten free, or I'm on the ketogenic diet, and I only know that word because I'm doing it right now, and that's why I'm talking so fast. But so this is a grace that we say after meals, but we also say blessings about food before a meal. There's one teaching that says if you have something that comes from God, but you don't say a blessing before you consume it, it's like stealing. Right, because we acknowledge before we enjoy or benefit from anything, whether it's food or mitzvot, that this was a gift from God for our sustenance and for making our lives better. So the answer is both. It's shorter before the meal, longer after the meal. A lot of great questions here. Is it okay to pray in English or other languages while we were still learning Hebrew? Thank you, Milo. Excellent question. The answer is absolutely yes. Whatever language you understand is the best language to pray in. And let me asterisk, hedge a little bit. So Jewish blessings and prayers are traditionally said in Hebrew. This is sort of our Mama Lashon, as a people, this is sort of our collective holy language. And when you can say the prayers in Hebrew, even if you don't understand them 100%, it's a good thing to learn how to say them in Hebrew. And over time, the more you say them in Hebrew, the more understanding you will gain. And God willing, someday you'll say them all in Hebrew and you'll understand them perfectly. If your knowledge of Hebrew or your ability to speak Hebrew or decode the symbols on the page is at a very beginner level, and you're like, this is frustrating, I'm not connecting to God at all, and I just want to say thank you, or I'm sorry, or please help, however you want to talk to God, it's totally okay to do it in any language that you understand. In fact, some would say that is preferable, that you are interfacing with God in a way that makes sense to you. Otherwise, it could be just sort of an empty exercise. And so I'm going to, they say 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I'm going to claim 2 right here. On the one hand, it's nice to practice prayers in Hebrew until you understand them. On the other hand, you can talk to God in whatever language you understand, trusting that God's going to understand that language as well. Let's see. How does Jewish prayer compare to... I lost it. The chat's going so fast. You guys are asking such great questions. I just saw a question like, how does Jewish prayer compare to Buddhist meditations? Sounds like they are similar. I'm going to punt this one because I know absolutely zero about Buddhist meditation. And so I can't compare them with any kind of knowledgeability. What I will say is my recommendation for a great book on Jewish meditation that actually taught me more about Jewish prayer than just meditation. And that is a book, I think it's just called Jewish Meditation by Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan. I might not say rabbi in the book, but Aryeh Kaplan wrote this book many, many years ago, kind of, in my mind, the sort of definitive introductory work on Jewish meditation. And he does draw parallels between Jewish meditation practices, and we'll say like Eastern and Asian meditation practices. And so, if you're familiar with Buddhist meditation, you will see the similarities. But what he takes great pains in pointing out that this isn't just a, let's say, Jewification of some other religious practice. Buddhism was very popular in the 60s and 70s in the U.S., and Jews who had sort of not been feeling connected to Judaism, like really couldn't get the hang of Jewish prayer, or just didn't speak to them, they started doing Buddhist meditation, and they found it much more effective. And so and a lot of synagogues are doing meditation services or guided meditations. I have a good friend and colleague, Rabbi Ariel Scholklapper, who leads Jewish mindfulness meditation workshops. What Rabbi Kaplan points out is that this isn't just sort of a schmaltz washing of other people's practices. This is actually native to Judaism going back millennia. And that it's actually that book where I learned that the Amidah, which you open up a prayer book, the Amidah is several pages of script, right, that you can say, that you're given the words to say. He says before we had that script, the Amidah was a silent, or at least private, meditation. And the words were added later to help people who didn't have the words to say or didn't know where to start. And so that is a great resource on Jewish meditation that I highly recommend. He may talk more about the connection or the similarities to Buddhist meditation. Rabbi Alan Lew, Lew, is also Alav Shalom. He's not with us anymore, but he's got a lot of books. I forget. It's like Be Still and Get Started, I think is one of them. I can't remember the name, but look up Alan Lew, Lew, and books on Jewish meditation. And he has done explicitly some kind of syncretic combining of Jewish prayer and Zen Buddhist meditation, and you can see a lot of the connections there. So jump right back. Whoops, is it true that there's a tradition to say 100 blessings per day? This was more of I'll say this was, it's not one of the 613 commandments, but a rabbi many, many years ago kind of threw this out as sort of an educational tool, as a goal, and said it's good for Jews to say 100 blessings every day. And that sounds like a lot. It's like, you have to carry a checklist. Do I have some prayer beads to count them off or something like that? But what somebody did was they looked at a Jewish day, and let's say if you're an observant Jew and you are praying 3 times a day, well, that's 3 Amidahs, and the Amidahs contain 19 blessings each. So math, what is that? Is it 57? Yeah, I think it's like 57. That's like 57. If you say the Amidah 19 times, or let's say 19 blessings times whatever 19 blessings times 3 is, that takes care of like 57 right off the bat, right? And you're over halfway there. Plus there's 3 or 4 blessings around the Shema, 2 different services. There's more there's blessings everywhere. If you do all the services, you're up to like 70. And then if you say Modani when you wake up in the morning, if you say the Birchot HaShachar, the 10 traditional morning blessings, that's another 10. And if you bless food that you eat, that's another blessing per meal, right? Plus the Birchot HaMazon, which has more blessings in it. So it's not like you have to go around and count your blessings. Well, counting your blessings, that's another thing that everybody should do. But if you are engaging in these traditional prayer practices, plus you're blessing your food before you eat it, plus you're blessing at communal meals afterwards, you're kind of covered, right? But that's just sort of a rubric or a framework to say, if just going about your business, a Jewish person could say 100 blessings every single day, which I think is pretty powerful to think about. Why do men, if women aren't available, wave their hands over candles after lighting candles? So this is interesting. This is more a minchag, a custom, if you will. However, minchag and custom are very important in Judaism. Let's see, who's asking this? FL Lady Medic, presumably from Florida. I'm just guessing there. I don't know. You do you. there is this custom when lighting Shabbat candles, whoever's lighting the Shabbat candles, it's, traditionally it's often women who do this, but men can do it too. Don't think that you can't light Shabbat candles just because you're a dude. Dudes out there, I can speak for dudes, my people. If you light the candles, and then people have this custom of, waving their hands over the flame and then covering their eyes. Covering their eyes is an altogether different thing that I can explain if you want me to. But what they do is they wave their hand, and I've heard different interpretations of this. I think it's just because somebody started doing it one time, and then another person said, "Oh, that's beautiful. I'm going to do it too." But the best explanation I've heard for people who do this is they say, "I feel like I am drawing Shabbat towards me." Because at that moment you are welcoming in Shabbat, right? There's sort of three ways to initiate Shabbat. One is to say the Psalms for Shabbat and Kabbalat Shabbat service that initiates Shabbat. Another way is saying kiddush. Like if you say kiddush, and this is like if you don't do the other two things, like saying a particular psalm in the service, that initiates Shabbat. Saying kiddush with a cup of wine or grape juice or what have you, that initiates Shabbat. But usually the earliest thing that initiates Shabbat is the lighting of those candles. And so the person doing this is literally like sort of urging Shabbat in, or welcoming Shabbat, or welcoming the light, the illumination aspect of Shabbat towards them. And so you light the candles, you bring in Shabbat, and then you cover your eyes to say the blessing. So let's see, that's a lot of hand waving I'm doing in this episode, I can tell. Let's see, for those who are looking, it's called Modeh Ani. That's the morning blessing. Zachariah Kazti says, "I'm Berber, and I don't know if you know anything about it." I do not. I know precious little about the Berber people. I'll confess that here. Why don't Jewish people put their hands together in prayer? That's a good question. That is also a custom, I think. We don't put our hands, like if you go into a Jewish prayer service, it's not like other prayer service. I mean, in some ways it's very much like it because it's in a big quiet building and people are shushing each other and everybody's quiet. Sometimes there's singing, sometimes there's a Bible being read. So there's a lot of similarities, but there is a different posture overall. You don't see this so much. I was taught that again, I learned this from Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan, that there is a sort of Kabbalistic mystical reason why we don't go like this. Like you're not supposed to interlock your fingers, you're supposed to keep them separate. So some people, when they meditate, will put their hands together just to have their hands doing something and not distracting them. But we don't do the steepled hands, and we don't bow our heads when we pray. Now there are parts in the service where we bow, but when somebody is praying a Jewish prayer, they don't put their heads down and close their eyes like this. One reason may be just to sort of distinguish it from other types of prayer services. One way is that we don't change our posture too much during prayer because we don't want to give the impression or teach other people this, that God is someplace, right? And so we don't look up when we pray, although that's kind of a natural inclination to face the heavens, if you will. But in our understanding, God is not in a place or sequestered in a single place. So we don't address ourselves to heaven. We just stand like we're standing, or we look at our prayer book. And some people will close their eyes, some people won't. However you get into the meditative habit is up to you. But we don't look up, lest we give people the impression that we think God is up there and just up there and not all around us. And all the more so, we don't face down, because we don't want to give people the impression that we are looking at a God exclusively of the underworld. So I know that that's not the intention when other people look down in prayer, but that's why we specifically avoid that. So I want to go back to the questions here. Is there a generic prayer you say when something good happens to you, like a generic thank you prayer? Seems like Most prayers are very specific. Yes, in fact, there are many very specific prayers for very specific good occasions, but may not have been thought of back in the day. Like my Uber came faster than I thought it was going to, and I'm happy about that. There's no blessing for an Uber per se. Or I got into medical school, and the ancient rabbis would be like, what's medical school? Right? So there are these good things that happen in our lives all the time, and we can be grateful for them, and we can even bless God as the source of that blessing. And there's a couple of different things you could say. One is Baruch Hashem, right? This is kind of a standard, Jewish phrase, Baruch Hashem, which means bless the name, or Hashem is one of the names that we use for God. Or we say a blessing that ends with Hatovu Metiv, right? We bless God who is good and creates good. So it's like Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Hatov Hametim, right? We bless God, sovereign of the universe, who is good and makes good, or gives good, if you will. So that's sort of there was a particular place that I was praying, and their habit was to have kind of a good and welfare part of the service where people would share good things that happened to them, and then after they shared that good thing, everybody would say that blessing. I would like to know why we cover our eyes. So there are parts, so maybe that's referring to the Shabbat candle ones, or maybe that's referring to a time when we say the Shema. I'll say the Shema, I'll do the Shema one first because it's easier. And the covering the hand, the covering the eyes for lighting Shabbat candles is a little bit more complicated, but you deserve to know the truth. So here goes. Often when people say the Shema, whether at home, in private, or in a synagogue service, they cover their eyes. This is because this prayer, this one sentence of 6 words, is the closest that we have to a creed, as it were. Like Judaism is much more about action than it is about belief. However, all of our actions sort of stipulate the oneness of God and our special relationship with God. And so when we say the Shema, that's like the central, there's a couple of sort of central points in the prayer service. The Shema is one of them. And so a custom is, when saying the Shema, to cover your eyes so that you're not distracted by anything else. Like you can pray through lots of distractions, but when we say the Shema, we like to have 100% focus on those words and the thoughts that they contain. For lighting the candles, that's a different thing. So most of the time, when we say blessings before doing a mitzvah, like we say blessings before we eat stuff, but we also say blessings before we do stuff, especially if that stuff is a mitzvah, a commandment given to us by God to improve our lives. And so most of the time, before we do a mitzvah, we say the blessing and then we do the mitzvah. And there are a couple of exceptions to this. One is washing the hands, netilat yadayim. We wash our hands first, and then we say the blessing. The reason for this is we are actually, in the process of washing our hands, elevating ourselves spiritually, and so it's preferable to invoke God's name after we have washed our hands versus beforehand. For the candle blessings, this has to do, and this kind of gets deep into the weeds of the halacha, the Jewish law about Shabbat, but bear with me just so you understand why this thing is done the way it is. You could say it's a custom and we just do it because people like us do things like that. But the halacha of it is, as I said before, lighting the candles for Shabbat initiates Shabbat, right? If we said the blessing of lighting, the blessing to God about lighting candles, that blessing also initiates Shabbat. So if we say the blessing, because we say at the end of it, Ner Shel Shabbat, the lights of Shabbat, we have essentially started the clock on Shabbat, as it were, or started Shabbat. Once Shabbat started, we are not supposed to create fire. And so if we said the blessing and then lit the flame, we would be basically breaking Shabbat right out of the gate. For people who follow this traditional halachic framework according to Jewish law. And so we devised this workaround, as it were, that we light the candles before it's Shabbat. And so it's okay to light candles before Shabbat. So we light the candles, and then we cover our eyes to say the blessing, and we don't have to, complete face mask, Oculus Rift VR, sleeping mask covering, like you can't see anything. You just have to block out the flame of the candles. Because what you do is you light the candles, you block the view of the candles, so it's as if they're not there. You say the blessing, and then when you uncover your eyes, it's like the candles have been lit, in the sense that, okay, I don't see candles, I see candles. And so in that way, we're saying the blessing, and then we're seeing the light without actually having lit fire on Shabbat. So that's why we have the custom of covering our eyes when we light Shabbat candles or candles in the beginning of a holiday and things like that. So again, kind of deep in the weeds, but you deserve the truth. So let me take a couple. We're getting some great questions today. I had this whole lecture prepared, but forget about it. These are so much better. Can you explain the bowing and the tippy toes at services? Thank you. Is everybody if you, we'll have some fun here. If you've seen people get up on their tippy toes in service, just do me a favor and type tippy toes into the chat, just because I want to see how many people do it. This makes me think of a George Carlin bit when from the album George Carlin at Madison Square Garden. He makes this sound, and then he asks everybody in the audience, on the count of 3, do that thing, and then you can hear thousands of people making that sound at once. So if you are listening to me right now and you've seen people get up on their tippy toes in services, type in tippy toes, and we'll see how this goes. Nobody yet, but we're on kind of a lag, or maybe I'm just being weird. So there's some choreography that goes into Jewish services. The tippy toes thing is sort of the easiest to explain, so I'll go there. There's a couple of parts at the service where, specifically in the kedusha, I'm seeing some tippy toes rolling here. Thank you everybody for playing along. In the kedusha, which is a part of the Amidah. So if you're praying in a minyan and the Amidah is being repeated out loud, you have sort of the first page of the Amidah, the first couple of blessings, and then we have what's called the kedusha. And this is acknowledging, this is a very long form blessing, acknowledging the holiness of God. And in it, we invoke passages from the scripture that talk, I think from the prophets, namely, that invoke these heavenly scenes of angels getting together and looking to each other for permission and then praising God, right? And they say, Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot, Melech Haaretz Kavodo, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. His, God's glory fills the whole world. And so this is a quotation from angels, right? I'm pretty sure it comes from the book of Isaiah, but it's a quotation from Isaiah describing the speech of angels. And so when we are speaking, when we're repeating the words of angels, what we do is we elevate ourselves, because we're basically in that moment acting like the angels who praise God. And so they're saying, hey, let's try to get as angelic as human beings can in a short period of time. And so people, when they say Kadosh, 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 they rise up on their toes 3 times. And then there's another place a little bit down the page where we are quoting angels again, and we get up on our toes one more time. So that's the tippy toe thing. The bowing, insofar as bowing happens in Jewish prayer, there's not a lot of kneeling except for one part of Yom Kippur, but we do bow sometimes. And the bowing is supposed to imitate. I'm struggling with a word that's not just imitate, but it's related to the image of a court, like a royal court, not a tennis court, but not court furniture, but like a royal court. And how one would behave in a court approaching a king or queen, right? We're approaching God as a sovereign. This happens at the Barhu. The Barhu is the call to prayer that we do right before we start the Shema part of the service. So it's like we're all face east, or we face the front of the synagogue. We're all oriented in the same direction, and we bow in the Barhu, sort of calling everyone to prayer, but also acknowledging the presence of God. In the Amidah, this happens a couple of times. First, in the beginning of the Amidah, people take you'll see people take, first off, everybody's standing, who's able to stand. Second, before people start the Amidah, they take 3 steps backward and then 3 steps forward. And the 3 steps backward is just so that you can take the 3 steps forward. You may be praying in a crowded room that's full of people. You want to take 3 steps forward to approach the Almighty. But if you don't have a lot of room to do that, you have to take 3 steps back first. So people take 3 steps back, 3 steps forward, and then they do kind of what I call the deep knee bend bow. I don't know where this comes from exactly, just the Jews have been doing it for a long time. My guess is it's related to the idea that that the word for blessing, bracha, or blessed baruch, which begins a lot of our blessings, is related to the word berech, or knee, right? When we bless, we bend our knee a little bit, and that is to, especially if you're approaching a king, you lower yourself down. If you're a supplicant in any way, you're saying, okay, that's my physical embodied acknowledgement that I am lower than you. So you bend at the knee, and then you bow. And then in the line that concludes that first blessing, people will sort of bow in 3 different directions, and then bend at the knee and bow again. And this is supposedly an imitation of courtly behavior at a time when this prayer kind of came together. So all of these bows are meant to remind us that we're in the presence of royalty, remind us that we're in the presence of the Almighty, and appropriately show deference in our bodies and in our stature. And then again, when the Amidah is finished, at the very last blessing, after some words of private meditation, people will then take 3 steps backward and bow again. And some people will bow 3 ways, some people will bow 1 way. But all of these gestures are to invoke the approaching the heavenly throne, if you will. And there's lots of other writings about this as well that I encourage you to find, but that's sort of my short answer. That's the bowing. The other time we bow typically is at the Aleinu prayer, which is part of the concluding prayers of every single formal prayer service. There's a line in the Aleinu prayer that says, we bend at the knee, it's like anachnu korim, we bend and bow and acknowledge the presence, or the sovereignty of God and our responsibility. So at that point where it says anachnu korim, where it says and we bend, people take it seriously and they bend and then they finish the prayer. So that's where the bowing comes from. That's where the tippy toes come from. So we got a lot of tippy toes, tippy toes, tippy toes. Yes, thank you everybody for playing along. I love it when we're interactive like this. If people are listening to this later as a recording or on the podcast or something, you won't get as much joy out of it as I am right now. But this will encourage you to come to another live recording session so that you can play tippy toe games with me as well. Let's see. Why is it important to grip the kiddush cup from the bottom? Is it symbolic or something? I don't have I was going to say I don't have a kiddush cup here, but in fact I do. This is one of my favorite kiddush cups. This was a gift to me by my previous congregation. And let's see, who's asking this? Ari is asking, so often when you see people saying kiddush, instead of holding the cup like this, they will hold it like this, right? And this is custom. There's some mystical significance to it. I don't know it 100%. I just sort of do it by habit. But one can say, instead of, gripping it in the normal way, we're holding it in a way that, you might present the cup to somebody else. You might present the cup to God, or you have your hand open, not in a tight fist, but open like this, when we're receiving blessings from heaven, when we're receiving the bounty of having joy in our lives, which is what the wine and kiddush represents. Let's see. Do Jews ever use mudras or sit in full or half lotus during prayer or meditation? I will say yes, just because I know lots of Jews do lots of things. I'm not 100% sure what a mudra is, but I believe it's some sort of body position. So yeah, there are Jews who do meditation services where they will sit in a meditative posture that is, possibly borrowed from another tradition. I have sort of 2 responsibilities. One is I like to teach traditional Jewish ways of doing things for people who want to learn traditional Jewish ways. But I'm also of the philosophy of you do you, right? And people have heard me say that quite a bit. If something helps bring you closer to God, unless it's completely like idolatry or disrespectful or something like that, which would be an extreme case, if doing something that's a little bit off the tradition helps you connect with God better, I am the last rabbi who's going to stand in the way of your doing that. And so if sitting in a half lotus position helps you build a, have a better prayer experience or actually makes you feel closer to God, then I think that takes priority for you over standing in a way that is imitative of other people around you, but makes you feel less connected. I will say there is something about the traditional choreography, I'll say, that has profound value. And that is this: when you are especially if this is stuff that's new to you, and it seems weird, people are rocking back and forth. Somebody asked me that question today: why the rocking back and forth? That's just a pattern of behavior that developed a few hundred years ago as people were getting more meditative into their prayer. It's sort of like the holy rollers in Christianity, who have really ecstatic movements and things like that. You will see people moving during prayer, but it's often in a rhythmic fashion that engenders a heightened meditative state. But that's not what the question was about. I forget what the question was about. But people will bend and people will bow and people will rock back and forth. If you're in a space of people doing this and it seems unfamiliar to you, my encouragement is for you to give it a try. Because there's something about moving your body the way other people are moving their body that forms, and this is sort of another priority of prayer, is it forges a connection to the community. It forges a connection to the people who are around you, who do these things because other people in their community are doing this. And this is again from the language of Seth Godin's book Tribes. People like us do things like this. And so if you try to be so different, if you have a practice for connecting to God that is so different from other people in your God connecting community, you feel like you're missing out on that community connection. So again, I'm not going to tell anybody what to do in that respect, but I'll say if you see people doing something weird, but everybody's doing it, give it a try. Don't jump off the Brooklyn Bridge because other people are jumping off the Brooklyn Bridge. But if there's meditative aspects and if there's choreography that other people are doing, give it a try and see if you feel over time more connected not only to God, but to the community of other people who are connecting to God. So let's see. We got tippy toes. We got mudras. We got generic prayer. I'm going to kind of look back. Let's see. Is there preaching service? Okay, this is a great question. Is there preaching service similar to how Sunday Christian service goes? I'll say yes, only longer. In my experience, and I did grow up in, people don't know this about me, I hope I don't shock you, I did grow up in Christian communities. I converted to Judaism going on about 20 years ago. But I'm very familiar with Christian services, and in my familiarity, Christian services on Sunday morning would run for about an hour. If you really want to be mad at the priest for giving a long sermon, they might go an hour and a half. But it would be about an hour service, and then a sermon that would run 20, 30, 40 minutes of that. There'd be some prayer ahead of time, prayer and songs ahead, big sermon, prayer and songs at the end, and then maybe you have communion or something. Depending on different denominations. In Jewish Saturday morning services, what is more typical, I'm not going to say it's like this every single place you might go, but what's more typical is a 2.5 to 3 hour service of lots of praying and singing with a 10-minute sermon in the middle. This is just an anthropological view of this is how a lot of Saturday morning services go, at least in the conservative world, which I'm most familiar with, but also in Orthodox settings that I visited. There might be a little bit longer in Reform settings, like fewer statutory prayers and more speaking. I went to a great service, like a Friday night service at a place called Romamu, which is sort of a non-denominational synagogue in New York, where there was lots of singing and there was lots of praying and things like that. But then when the rabbi got up to speak, he spoke for like 40 minutes. and this is almost unheard of at any place I've been. He happens to be, it's Rabbi David Ingvar, happens to be an incredibly engaging speaker, had something incredibly important to say that day. And so he spoke for 40, 45, 50 minutes, and you could have heard a pin drop in the kahal, in the audience, as it were, because they were so engaged. But for the most part, you'll have a lot of prayers and a little bit of preaching. As opposed to Christian services I've been to, not in a while, but if they're still the same, let me know. You'll have a little bit of praying and a lot of preaching. And so, again, that's my perception. I know not all Christian churches are the same. I did hear a story from a rabbi, teacher and mentor of mine, who was invited to come to a Christian church to speak. And he shows up, and the pastor says, "Okay, you've got an hour." And the rabbi said, "Oh dear, 99% of my sermons are 10 minutes long." And so he's like, "I don't have an hour of material. I can pray for 3 hours, but I can only speak for 10 minutes. So it's a little bit flipped in Jewish services. Let's see. Thank you for Happy Panda explaining mudras are special hand positions. Okay, I'm familiar with these, and I've actually seen these referred to in Jewish meditation books as well. Mudras are special hand positions during prayer. Wasn't sure if Jewish tradition has a similar kind of thing as Buddhism or Hinduism have. So there might be Jewish meditation practices that have these kinds of things. I've heard of Kabbalistic practices that involve body position or hand positions for some sort of significance. Not part of my practice, but it might be out there. If you could only go to one service, which service is more important, the Friday or Saturday service? I hesitate to give you an answer that will be written down in law. Don't tweet me on this. I'll do I statements. I'll express a personal preference, and this could be a bias based on the fact that I am a conservative rabbi and have largely spent 90% of my religious time in conservative synagogues. I like Saturday morning. And I really, for a couple of different reasons. Saturday morning is a time where, especially if you're lucky enough to structure your day that you don't have to be anywhere or work or something like that. And I say that because I know the traditional thing is, hey, nobody's supposed to be working on Saturday anyway. Where else do you have to be? I know that doesn't acknowledge the reality of many people's lives. Like, some people have lots of things to do on Saturday. Some people have to work on Saturday in order to pay their mortgage. And I say, look, you do you, and God willing, someday when you can make a different choice that you don't have to work on Saturday, make that choice. But for now, I don't want to shut you out. So people may think I'm kind of a wishy-washy teacher, but I'm speaking of my personal experience and personal experiences of people that I teach. If your day is structured in such a way that you can spend, the entirety of a Saturday morning doing something, I think there is value to going to a place for an extended period of time, for immersing yourself in that community, whether you know the prayers or not, but just hearing them and being quiet for that length of time. You have, and I know in Reformed congregations they do the Torah service on Friday nights as well in some places, but I really like the idea of having a Torah service, of having learning time. One time I was asking my rabbi, what's the essence of a Jewish prayer service? And he said, if you can, he says, John, that time where you're singing a song that everybody knows, and it could be like Happy Birthday, Take Me Out to the Ballpark, what have you, your school's fight song. But that experience of everybody is singing that song, and you feel somehow connected to all the people in the room, right? And I said, yeah, I'm familiar with that experience. He says, okay, you need 2 of those. And if you have 2 of those experiences and you can teach a little bit of Torah in between, that's a service. And for me, and you can do this on Friday night as well. There's the singing of the Kabbalat Shabbat service, and then there's usually a sermon or a teaching, and then the singing afterwards. I call this sort of the sing, learn, sing model, although I would add in Jewish settings, it's usually sing, learn, sing, eat. But it's just a reality there. But for me, on the Saturday morning part, each of those segments is longer, and I've made a decision to sort of set apart Saturday as a holy day, as Shabbat, and so I accept the gift of being able to luxuriate in a long period of singing for about an hour, and then a long period of learning, hearing the Torah scroll being read, hearing the prophets being read, hearing a sermon or a teaching by a rabbi, or giving a sermon or a teaching as a rabbi, and then going back into a singing mode, and then having kiddush after that at midday. It's a great way to start your Shabbat. And then usually, my wife will tell you, I then sack out and take a nap for like 3 hours until Shabbat's almost over. That's just how it is in my house. And I'm really grateful to my kids for being quiet during that time. They've stopped taking naps, but they're very respectful of my naps. So I like the Saturday morning service. I'm not going to say it's better or worse. There's just more to it. And for me, I like praying in Jewish spaces. And so I will take a 2.5 hour opportunity for holiness over a, let's say, 1 hour opportunity for holiness. But I'll just add this one last cryptic answer. Whatever service you can go to is the right service to go to, right? If I say Saturday and you can't do Saturday, so you don't go at all, that's the wrong answer. But if a Friday is something that you can make a commitment to and go to week after week, get to know the people there, get to know the prayers there, and you can't do that on Saturday, but you can on Friday, then Friday is absolutely the one that you should go to. If it works out that, work schedules, life schedules, whatever, that Saturday is the time that you can, I'll say whatever time you can go and go back, because that's where you really get the value out of Jewish prayer, is through repetition and absorption and becoming familiar with things and getting to know the people there. Whatever service helps you do that is the right service for you to go to. I hope that answers your question. Let's see. Somebody named Living Night. Oh, this is a Klutz Kasha, and I'll just call them out. Living Nightmare says, "Will I be rich and successful if I convert to Judaism?" Ha ha ha. No, you will not. You'll be rich and successful if you help a lot of people and work hard and serve people other than yourself. The whole secret conspiracy Jewish access to money is a complete myth, and I won't answer a question like that again. I just wanted to point this out. Let's see. Some people say, got the notification half an hour prior. I'm seeing a lot of references to the to notifications and things like that. I have to apologize, everybody. I'm still getting used to doing Facebook Live, or excuse me, YouTube Live, Has v'Shalom. And so these things aren't always going to work out super well. I will now learn how to do this thing so that people get notifications at the proper time. I decided it was more important to share this teaching and share this Torah with people rather than be perfect before I do any sharing of teaching in Torah. So I really appreciate everybody playing along with me. I know the videos this week were better than the videos last week. Maybe next week they'll be even better. So what do you think of, Kathy asks, what do you think of lay-led services? I think they are fantastic. That's what I think of lay-led services. Again, this is sort of, and at least I'm not going to speak for every rabbi. I know for me, I like it when people realize that I am not a priest, right? And Jewish cantors, while they serve and they're incredibly knowledgeable about liturgical and musical history and really help uplift people, and some rabbis do that too. There is nothing, there's nothing spiritually special about a rabbi. I'll just say a rabbi. I'm not going to talk about cantors. There's nothing special that I can do as a rabbi that any adult Jew can't do, right? And so sometimes people, and maybe I'm just going to wax on something that annoys me and nobody else cares. Sometimes people look at rabbis like priests, or look at cantors like priests, in the sense of, like a Catholic priest, there's something important. Again, I'm getting out of my area of expertise. My understanding is that Catholic priests serve a holy intermediary function within Catholic theology. There are sacraments, which is their word for mitzvot, that you can't do unless you have a priest help you, right? So a priest is a very important figure, and it has to be a priest to do certain things. Judaism does not work like that, right? Anybody who is a legal adult, meaning they are bound by Jewish law by virtue of being 13 if they're boys or 12 if they're girls, because the rabbis recognized a long time ago that women mature faster than men do. But a Jewish adult who knows how to lead a service can lead a service, right? As long as that person has the same obligation to pray as you do, they can say those prayers on your behalf. And I like to encourage people to do that because the Jewish prayer especially is accessible to everyone. Competent prayer leadership, and that's a skill. I'm not going to say, look, okay, anybody can get up and do it. It is good to have somebody who prays and leads skillfully in a way that helps uplift everybody, in a way that doesn't have a lot of mistakes that distract people. So as long as somebody knows how to lead prayers, any Jewish adult can lead prayers. In different communities, it differs by who they allow to do that by gender and things like that. In some communities, only men are allowed to lead prayer. And in some communities, men and women are allowed to lead prayer. But lay-led, in my mind, lay-led prayer experiences are the absolute best. One, because there are some incredibly talented lay people out there. And two, because I like to encourage people to own their own Judaism. And I'll just say, it bothers me sometimes if I'm, let's say, at a Shabbat service and they say, oh, there's the rabbi. Why don't you say hamotzi, or why don't you do the kiddush? Because I feel like there's this sense of inferiority or something on the part of regular Jews that said, oh, I can't, the rabbi's more qualified to do that than I am. And I like to bust that myth, right? Anybody who knows the words to the hamotzi can say the hamotzi. Anybody who knows the words to kiddush can say the kiddush. And I like to encourage Jews who aren't rabbis to do that as often as possible, just to bust that myth of hierarchy and status that is not native to Judaism, but has sort of been projected on us by either the days of the priesthood in our own tradition or other religious settings today. So I absolutely love lay-led congregations. The more people I think who know how to own their Judaism, the better. So I'm all for it. So I'm going to answer a couple of things. I gave us a bit of a history of Jewish prayer. I think the Q&A has actually probably been more useful than the lecture that I had prepared. I'll say people who are in the Jew Curious School have already heard this lecture. What I mainly wanted to cover was the transition from sacrifice to prayer to make it clear to everybody in the world, because you'd be surprised how often this question still gets asked. Jews do not do animal sacrifice anymore, right? That was the thing that we did in the temple. The last time we did that was approximately 1,000 years ago. There are some small groups like Samaritans in the Holy Land today who still do animal sacrifices. But by and large, rabbinic Jews, which is what most Jews are today, we don't do animal sacrifices. Now we pray instead, in place of. And there are also great alternative modes of worship. Even Maimonides back in the day saw that first sacrifices were a transitionary thing that we needed more than God needed. But God said, here, you do sacrifices until you're ready for a higher level of service. And Maimonides foresaw a time in which people would, instead of praying 3 times a day in memory of the sacrifices, would come up with perhaps better forms of worship. For him, as a rationalist and a philosopher, he thought people should sit around thinking about God all day like philosophers do, but spoken like a true philosopher. And maybe someday that will be it. But for right now, by and large, if you want to know what Jews do, I wanted to give you the essence of why we pray instead of sacrifices, why we pray 3 times a day, which is related to the sacrifices, how there are some additional prayers on top of that for things like Shabbat and holidays. And it's really been my honor to answer some great questions. Let me take a look here just to see if there are any more notification stuff. Was there a time when Judaism had priests like people as a part of prayer services? I'm not sure I 100% understand that question. Was there a time when Judaism had priests like people as a part of prayer services? So the closest thing we have is what's called the vernacular is shaliach tzibur, right? Which means an agent of the community or a representative of the public. And so there have always, often people will just get together in a space and pray. usually if there's a community praying together, there's one person who is the shaliach tzibor, or the prayer leader, right? And that could be a rabbi, it could be a cantor, it could be anybody who's an adult, right? And that prayer leader would, while everybody was sort of praying in formation silently or aloud, the prayer leader would say the prayers aloud, or some of the prayers aloud, as kind of like, I don't know, like the stroke on a cruise shell, like the person who is, sort of most knowledgeable, has the best voice, or is the best person to pray on behalf of those who don't know how to pray. And so you will have a person leading services, and sometimes that person will lead kiddush, and so they'll say the blessing over kiddush, but that kiddush will be on behalf of everybody else, and some other people might drink the wine as well. So there is, at least in appearance, at least in their location in the room, it looks kind of like a priest, so it's priest-like. And in some texts, I think it was Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman writes sort of the three roles of a rabbi or a religious leader as being a priest, a prophet, and a pastor. There are times when we do priestly things, like we're not priests, but there are times we do priestly things, like lead services, not because we're special, but because we know how, because we're the most knowledgeable about how to do that. That's the priestly function. The prophetic function is we act like prophets, and that's what sermons are for. It's like we take a look at the world. We see what's wrong with it. We tell people how to fix their lives, or we tell people how to fix their, civic engagement situation. That's what prophets did. They were social critics, but from a place of holiness. And so we are priestly when we lead services. We can be at best like prophets when we deliver sermons, and then we are pastors in the sense of comforting the people who need comfort. Right? We visit people at hospitals. We visit, we officiate weddings and funerals, and are there for people in important moments in their lives, and in stressful periods of their lives to help ease some of that stress. And so these are kind of the different roles of a rabbi. Cantors take on all of these roles as well, but you can also have a knowledgeable and caring layperson in that role as well. So I want to close the discussion. We've been talking for about an hour and 18 minutes now, with gratitude, with tremendous gratitude to everyone who has come here today to ask really great questions, to learn with me, to learn from each other. I see some references back and forth in the chat of people answering each other's questions if I didn't get to them, or providing links to other information. Thank you for that. I just want to throw in just a quick plug for the Jew Curious School. People have heard me talk about that before. Many of the people in the chat today are a part of that school. If you like learning with me, if you like learning with me live, if you like learning in a community, as you can see, we have all these people answering each other's questions, helping each other, supporting each other. That's what the Jew Curious School is all about. It's a little bit like what we did today, only turned up to 11D. If that's a number. So, we do that as a part of a private community. So check that out. There's been links going back and forth on that in this video. And for people who are listening to this later, just go to rabbijohncarrier.com/school. And you can find more information about the Jew Curious School. There's lots of ways to connect to me otherwise. Check it out in the notes to this video. If you're listening to the podcast, check it out in the show notes. But I just want to close with gratitude. Thank you, everybody, for learning with me, for bringing excellent questions. And until next time, heroes, peace and Shabbat Shalom.